Oh, well, hello there, comrades. I didn't see you come in. Welcome to Red Library. As always, thanks for joining us this week on the show. We have the first of a very exciting, a very radical, a very theory-rich two-parter coming your way on Jean Baudrillard, the Chad of postmodernism, the wizard of the code, starting now. Well, not right now, but in a few minutes, obviously, once the intro's done. Our most excellent comrade and fellow shitposting podcaster, Comrade Cooper Cherry, or Triple C as I'm affectionately calling him now, is here in the library. Last time we were on his show, now this time, he's stepping in to the dungeon of books, the theoretical gauntlet, to lay down some liquid hot fire, some icy cold motherfucking takes on Jean Baudrillard's Symbolic Exchange and Death from 1976. This one is hard to really summarize, to be honest. I usually like to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about, but this one's all over the place. We're going to talk about Baudrillard in terms of his historical context, situate him on the left, but we're going to talk about death, capitalism, fashion, the supreme brick. We're going to talk about Waluigi. There's just a lot going on. So we're just going to jump right in. Let's run down our typical ways that you can support Red Library if you are so inclined and do not do so already. First and foremost, if you'd like to become a patron, head over to our Patreon page. You can find a link in the show notes, and for as little as $1 a month or roughly a quarter per episode, you can get access to all of our premium content. We have about 9 or 10 episodes over there right now. You can access our Discord server, join us for Red Library Cinema on Tuesday nights, where we watch sometimes good films, mostly bad films, and shit talk and make really corny but hilarious leftist jokes about those films. And I am very happy to say that we are 3 patrons away from our goal of 50 that we've been working up to since we started the show. Big shout out to all of our new patrons. You have been recognized by the big other of Red Library. You are valid. If you're listening on iTunes, please head down and give us one of those star reviews, subscribe, share the show around, all that good stuff. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and just keep listening. Keep thinking, keep critically analyzing, keep challenging yourself, maybe challenge others, maybe encourage others to engage in self-crit and write essays about all the things they did wrong, theoretically and politically. I don't know about that last one. Just proceed with caution. All right, here we go. Me and Triple C on Jean Baudrillard's Symbolic Exchange and Death, Part 1. Enjoy. Yo, yo, yo. What's up, everybody? What's up, comrade listeners from around the world? Welcome to the library this week. We have an incredible and inimitable guest in the library for the first time, and I'm going to let them weave their magic upon you. So, go. You have the floor, sir.
I have the floor. My name is Cooper Cherry, host of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour podcast. I think there's probably a lot of overlap in terms of our projects.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think areas of interest. I'm kind of, I think, primarily focused on things related to, I guess, anarchist thought, but also post-structuralism is a huge interest of mine. And so the podcast, I think, particularly lately, has really taken a severe focus in that direction more than anything. And Baudrillard, in particular, whom we'll be discussing today in his Symbolic Exchange and Death book, is an absolute favorite of mine. So this is a discussion that I'm really looking forward to.
I have to tell you, wanting to tackle the post-structuralist Chad, the wizard of the hyperreal himself, Jean Baudrillard, is quite an ambitious task. But we haven't done Baudrillard, and so I think us collaborating on this episode is actually kind of the perfect thing to pick.
Yeah.
So I was really excited whenever you wanted to do this text in particular. It's funny because whenever I think about our episode we did on Zizek's pandemic book, and now doing this and thinking about what our sort of shared areas of interest are, where the overlap is, I'm definitely like Lacan, psychoanalysis, post-structuralism, but also Waluigi and shit like that. So I was looking through your notes and I was like, oh, hell yeah, we're talking Waluigi today.
I stumbled onto an Ask Philosophy subreddit post about Baudrillard and getting into him, and they had this fantastic little thing about Luigi and like applying, I guess, what you would consider this sort of simulacra or hyperreal it's a really good explanation that we'll get to, once we move along in the episode. So
yeah, I mean, the little bit that I read, I was very excited. I feel like that'll be a great thing to tackle. And for me too, just from the Red Library perspective, one of the reasons why I'm really glad we get to tackle stuff like this and work with shows like yours is because, in my experience on the left, especially coming from like more socialist and communist sort of organizing groups, I think there's a tendency to read in a very limited sort of way to understand questions about politics and the economy and society and everything else. I think those things are still valuable, but there's also, I think, so much value to engage with people like Deleuze and Guattari and Baudrillard as well. And so I love that we get to do this and kind of try to read these things, or like take these two perspectives and kind of like slam them against each other and see what happens. Because, people like Baudrillard are emerging out of that tradition and very critical of it in a way and trying to tackle new developments of technology and consumer society. And it's always struck me that we have to be really serious about understanding those problems wherever you're at on the left, because that's kind of the society, that we live in, because we live in a society, obviously.
I think too, in particular, something that's really useful for people that are interested in even just like Marxist political economy is that Baudrillard does use that terminology. He uses that vocabulary quite a bit. And so I actually think for someone like myself who is more qualitatively oriented, it can be a little bit easier to make those concepts real. And whenever you're applying them to communication or symbols or like culture itself, like it kind of reinforces or like makes really good examples of, it can kind of help really improve, like it's funny, like retroactively going back and looking at Marx, like it kind of fills in that terminology a lot more clearly, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. I know we got a lot to talk about and a lot of really complicated, dense shit to talk about. Do you want to plug your show or any of your social media stuff or anything before we get started, just so listeners know where they can find you before we get into the discussion?
Absolutely. So you can find Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour on anywhere where you find podcasts, whether it be Spotify. I am hosted on SoundCloud. The podcast is available on iTunes as well. Machinic Unconscious Happy Hours. You search that and you'll find it, no doubt about that. We do have a Patreon for anyone who feels like they're enjoying the show and getting something out of it. You can find us at patreon.com/MUHH. The podcast Twitter account is at unconsciousHH, and then we're also on Instagram at unconsciousHH.
Okay, word. And I'll put all that stuff in the show notes for anyone to make sure they can go down and just find links that way. And I'm sure we're going to have to link probably a good amount of things that we're going to reference in our discussion today too. So listeners out there, make sure you go down and look at all that stuff. So we're talking about Baudrillard's Symbolic Exchange and Death. And I have to tell you really quick, I don't know if I think I did mention this to you. I don't know if it was in the middle of our episode that we did together for your show or not, but I have a really like deeply personal and sort of weird relationship to Baudrillard, because for a lot of listeners who may or may not know this, Baudrillard, I think, sort of reemerged in the modern social consciousness, especially for a lot of like theory cells and shit like you and I, whenever the first Matrix film came out, because the book that Neo keeps his discs in at the beginning of the film is actually, is it Simulacra and Simulation or Simulation and Simulacra? I can't remember which one comes first.
It's Simulacra and Simulation.
Okay, yeah. So he like basically has a book and it's Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard.
Whoa.
Now, to be fair, Baudrillard's perspective on it was that basically the Matrix understood nothing about what he was actually trying to say in that book. But I think that Baudrillard, sometimes that can be the first time people encounter him and his name is basically through this connection through the Matrix. I'm curious, before we get into the context of the book and sort of the, the more serious shit. So what was your first introduction of Baudrillard, or kind of like what made you gravitate towards his work and his writing?
So it was during undergrad. I was an English major, and I had a professor that I went to because had been introduced to Derrida at that point, and I'm trying to think, and Foucault a bit. And so I went to a professor in their office hours, and I was like, "Hey, I'm super interested in postmodernism, post-structuralism. What do you recommend that I read?" One of the titles was Simulacra and Simulation. The other was 1,000 Plateaus.
Holy
that was
shit.
Kind of my yeah, which I didn't actually. I tried to read 1,000 Plateaus at that point, but I never really got very far into it. But Baudrillard, I thought, is a lot more accessible in terms of just being able to parse the text, even though it can he can get super confusing or challenging if you're not familiar with that kind of like Saussurean linguistics or semiotics, or even Marxist political economy.
Yeah, I think it really does draw on those two traditions and definitely weaving those together in different ways. So I know whenever I first
but also psychoanalysis too.
Yeah, right.
Which at the time I really didn't like. I had no exposure to psychoanalysis at all.
Yeah, I think whenever I first read Baudrillard, the reason why I have such a weird personal connection to it isn't just because of the Matrix, but also whenever I first got interested in reading Baudrillard, and, actually coming out of reading shit more like Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault and like post-structuralism and French thought, myself and actually Don and Alex, who are, also like mainstays on Red Library, we all were doing this reading group at a local anarchist bookstore where there was, this like very rando guy who just was obsessed with Baudrillard, like thought Baudrillard was just the next messiah, and also owned a pet wolf. And so we would show up to like read Baudrillard, Simulacra and Simulation on Monday nights with just this like guy who was just like always wore like military fatigue pants and was like, I think like in a punk band, but who just thought Baudrillard was like the second coming of Christ, and also had a pet wolf. And there was just something about where I was like, that was so heavy metal. Like everything about that was so incredibly metal. And it just made sense for Baudrillard. Right, yeah, that's pure dialectics, pure dialectic shit.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I think that to me, like whenever I did read Baudrillard though, I remember I didn't have a lot of really thorough reading in Marxism. Definitely had read Freud, but wasn't like really in depth on psychoanalysis yet. And I think I was just starting to get a grasp of things like semiotics. And so it was very disorienting to read him. And it took a lot of cognitive fucking labor just to be like, what the hell is this guy saying? So hopefully we can try to like fill out some of that for anyone who doesn't have that much background and try to make kind of the ideas relatable and understandable, I think.
Like I said before, the application of kind of Marxist political economy to cultural artifacts, whether it be language or fashion, etc., which Baudrillard is primarily focused on here, I think really does help kind of give those like a hard, like theoretical grounding in terms of things that we're always familiar with. And that I think, especially particularly in today's world, insane that he wrote this book in 1976. And, here we are in 2020, and it's incredible. It's uncanny that he was sort of able to see the trends in society at that point to the moment that we're at now. I remember, right around the time that the 2016 election happened, I kind of like tell this anecdote about kind of waking up in the middle of the night and being like, holy shit, this is Baudrillard. That son of a bitch was right about everything.
You're like angrily shaking your fist at Baudrillard, like, Baudrillard! Like just like a mean old man on the road in The Simpsons shaking your fist at Baudrillard. In the past.
Oh, you lousy Springfielder, you shake harder, boy!
So I was also curious too, because whenever I think about Baudrillard, the image I always get in my mind, funny enough it's an image, is actually Andy Warhol's replication of an image ad infinitum, like whether it's Marilyn Monroe or it's like pictures of Mao. But like every time I think about Baudrillard, that's what I always imagine. It's this sort of the impact of the ability to infinitely replicate images and signs, and the effect of that on like society and political economy as a whole, and what that means in consumer society. So I think still, to me, that's why I find Baudrillard really relevant. And I think you're right. I mean, I think he was incredibly prescient in so many ways, because he was theorizing this break from an older form of political economy that wasn't able to understand, or maybe was at a different era whenever this ability to replicate things ad infinitum like wasn't so firmly developed.
I think it's interesting too that you mentioned the Warhol, because there's a prior translation of the book that it's got like it's 9 panels or whatever. Kind of like, I think it's obviously referencing the Andy Warhol thing too, but it's with the skeleton.
Yeah, I actually think I saw that cover whenever I was looking this up and like kind of reading some reviews and stuff at some point before we recorded today. So, but yeah, so for anyone who isn't familiar with those works of Andy Warhol, like to me, I just like can't disentangle Baudrillard from that sort of like approach to art.
Definitely makes sense, especially because Warhol was what he had the factory, right? And so it's kind of the factory of like cultural reproduction and consumption that I think, or like there's like a production that's disentangled from any kind of use value, and it's simply like this reproduction element, which is a huge focus of what the book is about too. So I think that's a great parallel.
So maybe just to start, I know you mentioned that this was published in 1976, and I always like to think about what is the purpose of reading this book right now, or what should we take from it in terms of its relevance? Because, I think it is important to just realize not every book is super relevant to read, so if we're going to spend an episode on it, like, why do we want to do this book? And I thought you had some great thoughts here. So I was wondering if you want to just start off giving us like a brief rundown of what you think the relevance of Baudrillard in this book is.
Sure. So I think, first off, we should situate this in a historical context, right? And this is published 8 years after the 68 student movement in France, which I think Baudrillard in particular is very much, forget his involvement, honestly, at the level. He might have even had like some, maybe conflating him with Deleuze and Guattari, but I want to say that he was even like involved in some actions. But I think, like I said, he sort of foresaw so much of what our current world is. Like the trends that he saw are just now, I think, really ramping up and I think accelerating in just an incredible fashion. And I kind of call him the Zarathustra of our postmodern kind of epic, to kind of reflect on that kind of Nietzschean idea of Zarathustra, the kind of prophet, the like Old Testament prophet that's been in this sort of cave, and he comes down and he brings us this this knowledge, this kind of cursed knowledge of the world that we're living in, where mass media has totally become this sort of new set of material conditions that really we begin to separate human culture from like any semblance of the capital R real, and it's all running on sort of this sort of just internalized, I don't know, it's kind of like an inescapable loop of like language and symbols and everything that still has this sort of relic of being attached to kind of a real outside of us, but that has totally, like, that relationship is sort of, at the time he was writing, was beginning to fray. And I think now you can see that's totally become disentangled from any sense of the real, although the real can still puncture into the sort of, I don't know, imaginary or symbolic realms that were existing. And it's hard to deny the accuracy of what he described and applying it to our current world. So that's what I think the most important thing is. He's been proven right about so much of what he wrote about.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways I think about it from even a more standard kind of Marxist framework is that we're looking at a philosopher, a theorizer of the changes in technology and the relations of production that come about whenever technology, especially in mass communication and consumerism, advance to the point where things no longer necessarily need to reference like an actual, like a signified, like an actual thing that exists, but can now just increasingly reference just themselves and other symbols. And the way that this kind of like has this effect of like a top that kind of spins. I remember he talks about it this way in Simulacra and Simulation, which I remember was really impactful on me, was the way that as this builds up momentum more and more, all of a sudden signifiers and symbols are now just like referencing other signifiers and symbols, and they don't even necessarily have to have any connection to like an actual like material referent anymore. And it creates this experience of what he calls the hyper real, where it's like that what they're existing as, or basically the sort of the whole basis of these signs is that they're never actually referencing anything that ever really existed. They're just referencing, sort of this idea of something that's purely mediated by signs. And I think still to this day, the best example of this is the pumpkin spice latte from Starbucks, because there is no actual flavor in the pumpkin spice latte that is actually based on spice or pumpkin. It is just a pure made up flavor that they just concocted in like some sort of lab that they did and like tested, and then they call it pumpkin spice, but it doesn't actually refer to anything real and concrete. It's something that is purely like made up in the realm of the symbol.
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic example. Just some kind of interesting notes too, to like just put this in context as far as Baudrillard's work goes, is one thing I think that is really kind of interesting and impressive is that his dissertation committee was 3 gentlemen: Henri Lefebvre, Pierre Bourdieu, and Roland Barthes.
Oh, Chad shit.
And, yeah, so holy shit. Like, could you imagine defending your dissertation with those 3?
But the dream will rise to the top. Oh, yeah.
Even just one of them, even like just Lefebvre, for example, who I
Yeah.
think is lesser known, would be impressive, but to have all three of them is really something else. And his first, I think his dissertation was actually in System of Objects, I think is primarily a more Marx-based, kind of a Marx-based, his first two books, the dissertation, and then I think the Mirror of Production are more in line with Marx, and Symbolic Exchange and Death is where he kind of abandons Marx, although he's still using a lot of the political economy terminology. He is very much critiquing Marx as well here. And sort of it's marks a break in his work that I think accelerates moving forward.
So let me just say this too, and just to frame this, I know that you are real major into Deleuze and Guattari lately. So I saw that you had this note on here about this being Baudrillard's anti-Oedipus. So I wondered if you could maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so I don't have anything backing this up. This is pure conjecture, but I feel like The Mirror Production was Baudrillard's second book that was published in 73, I believe. Yeah, it was published in 73, and I want to say that Anti-Oedipus was published in 72 or 73, and I get the feeling that break from Marx that I described earlier is a result of Baudrillard getting his hands on Anti-Oedipus, because he does reference them. He references Anti-Oedipus specifically, as well as the kind of concept of the machinic unconscious here, and he's adding his critique to it. So, like I said, I don't have any, maybe someone else who's a better historian would know, but that's kind of my my theory here, is that he's very much, that's where the break with Marx, and specifically too because there's so much overlap in terms of content and the approach, right? Because it's kind of this tripartite. It's like this Borromean knot, right, of psychoanalysis, political economy, and semiotics. And he's really critiquing Marx quite a bit. He's critiquing the psychoanalytic tradition. The kind of bigger kind of contrast, though, where he's a little bit different is he's taking a more anthropological approach, borrowing probably from, I think it's Marcel Mauss, who I'm not as familiar with in terms of the body of work, although I do know that that's a direct influence here. And this book actually has a lot of that more anthropological approach in relation to symbolic exchange and death. And in particular, I think chapter 5 in particular is going to be the most anthropological.
Thinking about just like context and stuff and sort of where Baudrillard's coming from, I'm sort of curious. I mean, thinking about your sort of like anarchist perspective, and even thinking about, me coming from a Marxist one, I'm curious like where you would sort of place Baudrillard in sort of the just general spectrum of like left politics. Do you see him as being more anarchist in his approach at the end of the day?
It's difficult to say. I almost equate him as he has a little bit of overlap, I think, with like an accelerationist kind of standpoint to some degree, except I don't think that he has the like faith in technology, but he's very nihilistic. So I think I would consider him probably like a post-left of some kind, like or post-Marx, right?
Yeah.
Is probably the best way to consider him. So I think he would probably be, and he is skeptical of Marxist, the Marxist project in this book, primarily because of this transition from production being the center of like human activity to now. And I think maybe we should bracket that out as like, particularly in the imperial court in the West, consumption has supplanted productive relations as the new driver of, whatever you want to, I don't know if you want to refer to that as the real or society or, culture, et cetera, right?
I'm glad you spoke to that. I was really curious for us to sort of think about that as well, is how this shift from primarily relations of production to ones of consumption, and that being the focus. I know you had a note in here where for Baudrillard, it's the idea is that consumption is control and that consumption is oppression. And so that to me is like really interesting, the idea of that we can't necessarily think about the primary means of control and oppression. And well, I think we could pose a question of, is exploitation equally present in the realm of consumption as it is production, or definitionally are those like two separate spheres. But I will say I think that that's what's really interesting is to think about how many Marxists at this time are trying to theorize the shift from more like World War II and sort of like earlier eras, like those focus on like factory production, but now in the imperial core, thinking about consumption becomes the primary sort of driver of economic activity in life. And like, what does that actually mean? Because even like someone like Ernest Mandel writes this book, Late Capitalism, not too long before this. And, you know, it's him trying to theorize in terms of political economy, the shift from World War II to consumer society. But his approach is so fundamentally different than what Baudrillard does. So I'm like also curious for you, like whenever you think about Baudrillard being post-Marx, do you see that the post-Marx element is specifically in the shift to focusing on consumer society and consumption versus production?
Yeah, I would say that's the primary, I guess, fulcrum point, or where they begin to branch apart is, and it's specifically too, like in terms of Baudrillard's work, this book is where that kind of that pivot takes place. Yeah, significantly. And I think too, maybe we should back up even and contextualize this in the context of the student movement in '68, and you know, all the way that shook out in terms of like the French Communist Party, etc. And like also I think the '56, like the tanky quote unquote moment to
the rise of the tanky.
Praise to the old man of steel. Holodomor is not real. That shit did not happen. Praise Stalin. Let's go.
What was that Hungarian sort of uprising that the Soviets sent in the tanks, right? So that's where the whole generative source of that term arises. And so this is coming pretty soon after, obviously a couple of decades after the Hungarian situation, but you know, '68 I think is very fresh in the mind of Baudrillard at this point, and kind of I think that's where the demarcation is sort of beginning. That's where like this jump into also like it's simultaneously neoliberalism is also occurring at this point in that kind of like 68 through 73 time period. And so I think that's something you have to keep in mind when you're especially if you're someone who's a Marxist and kind of like understanding the material conditions that arise and provide context for Baudrillard's work and why he makes this leap too, you know?
Yeah. I think that's a really good connection to make as well, is that, you know, if the focus is on material conditions and how the shifts in those bring about corresponding changes in all levels of society, I think sometimes Marxists are very skeptical about people like Deleuze or people like Baudrillard, because the idea is like, well, it's kind of this very idealistic, you know, again, not in the sense of like being really optimistic, but in contrast to material, focus on theorizing and how to understand the processes of capital and exploitation and oppression and all this other stuff. I mean, to me, that always struck me as being like a really tendentious reading. It's almost like, well, I mean, maybe you just don't want to have to invest your effort in reading anything besides Lenin and State and Revolution. It's like, because I think Baudrillard and Deleuze and Foucault, like they are responding to changes in material relations. And I feel like especially Foucault was always really clear about that. Like whenever I remember reading Foucault really intensely, and even Deleuze and like Baudrillard, I remember thinking like, how is it possible to actually read this and still say this isn't related to like material conditions of society? It's like, that's the whole fucking point, is to say like, we've now advanced in these material conditions, or they've progressed in a way, or like moved in a way that we have to like understand the really catastrophic shifts in the way that, like media and consumption work. So to me, like being a good Marxist would necessitate reading shit like this really seriously. That's always been my thought.
I totally agree. And my argument too is that a lot of the pro-structuralist critique is itself, it's not dialectical materialism, but is materialist oriented, broadly speaking, right? So I think that's the issue that a lot of people don't quite grasp, is like, yes, it's not dialectical materialism or what have you, but this is still a materialist analysis of society, of culture, of economy, etc., right? And I think the problematic element is that people want prescriptive things, right? And I think, you know, from a philosophical standpoint, I can understand like this is okay. So the whole post-structuralist thing is more like a critique than a prescriptive. You do X, you do Y. And maybe that actually goes back to answer that question about where I see Baudrillard fitting in the context of anarchism, right? Because there is like the whole idea of there being a prescriptive program that you follow in this sort of dialectical relation. It sort of undermines the whole point of an ideology like anarchism to some degree.
Maybe we can talk about this near the end too, because I won't let the cat out of the bag just yet, but I do know that, there are some critiques that this particular approach that Baudrillard takes, like, eventually leads to a sort of, dare I say, nihilism, and a sort of like acquiescing that basically it is impossible to change anything. Whether that's an accurate reading or not, maybe we can save that till the end. But I will say I think that that's an interesting, like, common critique about post-structuralist thinkers, especially Foucault and especially Baudrillard, is that their critiques are valuable and necessary, and yet at the same time they also, like, concede too much to structures of power and then make it seem as if, like, there is no place for some sort of insertion of, like, revolt or, like, rebelling or sort of some sort of emancipatory move. And I mean, again, that's like probably a whole series of episodes of why that is, but maybe we can at least touch on that at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty fair criticism of Baudrillard in particular. He's not very, I don't know, he doesn't present a lot of options or routes for escape throughout his work. He is pretty nihilistic, but that's kind of what I enjoy about reading him. So there's that, but I also think, like, whenever you see his predictions play out so accurately as far as the simulacra and simulation kind of stuff in hyperreality, it's difficult to dismiss entirely. But yeah, I think that's actually a pretty fair criticism of him. He revels too. I think he loves to be that fly in the ointment kind of writer.
Yeah, I think he definitely liked to trigger people, especially, like, hardcore, like, theory cells and, like, Marxists too. I will tell you this, I mean, I think to some degree, since we're going to touch on psychoanalysis to some degree, I think looking at someone like Baudrillard and expecting, like, a prescriptive program is, again, something to be really cautious about, how much you're stepping into that place of the hysteric, right? Saying, like, the point of reading theory isn't necessarily because we want, like, a prescriptive program of, like, what we should do to stop capitalism or whatever. It's like, I think someone like Zizek would say that's actually not the point of theory. Like, theory is to help you pose questions and, like, reframe the basic coordinates of the world in new ways.
Right.
That isn't necessarily the same thing as telling you, like, what you should do, and in some ways I think there's even in people like Zizek a hesitation to make proscriptive claims like that. So I mean, I think people who read Baudrillard and then get pissed about that, it's almost like, well, I would ask, like, why the fuck are you reading theory, and what do you think the point of this is? And I don't necessarily think theory per se is about providing, like, a prescriptive program for something. That's maybe what politics is about, but not so much like reading theory for, like, Baudrillard per se.
Yeah, I think here is this is just an aside, like something you can kind of put a pin in to think about is, and I think particularly of Foucault as well, is like this sort of anti-humanist turn that we're taking in the sort of post-structuralist era. And saying, like, okay, is the subject even a thing? Is the subject even a thing that can be liberated? Or what does liberty look like? Is that even a possibility of, you know what I mean? If there is no real subject, then what are we liberating to some degree? Although, that's kind of a crude, but just something I wanted to kind of bring up as an aside.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good one. I mean, I think it's definitely one of the primary critiques of the post-structuralist tradition, especially of, like, Western philosophy, to really have to engage with that. And that's something for Marxists to think about too, right? Because even Marxism, even in its, like, more radical variants, is still based on this idea of, like, emancipation and liberation. So the question is, like, who exactly are we liberating and what are we liberating? And then we could talk about how Lacanian psychoanalysis gives a different answer to that than most of the Western tradition. But again, we'll stick a pin in that for right now, because we still have this whole fucking book to talk about.
Yeah.
So let's talk about symbolic exchange. I was looking at the very start of the introduction. I know you touched on Marcel Mauss a little bit, but let's start unpacking this, because this is good stuff. This is classic Baudrillard shit right here.
What this is doing is kind of taking, like I said earlier, an anthropological approach to this idea, the idea of exchange itself, and what that looked like in more primitive cultures that didn't exist under the strict orders of, like, capitalism, although there could have been, like, pre-capitalist elements in these societies. It's definitely not to the extent that it is now, that we're, like, completely sort of territorialized by capitalism and the mode of exchange of, I don't know, Baudrillard says that we no longer have, like, symbolic exchange. We have sort of this, I don't even know what he refers to it as. The symbolic exchange is kind of that sort of hunter-gatherer element that we've lost this symbolic element of exchange, and now it's this weird hyper-real exchange of signs that, like we said earlier, doesn't necessarily reference any kind of real outside of us.
So one of the things I find really interesting here is the idea that in symbolic exchange, at least let's say prior to modern forms of capitalism and especially consumer-based capitalism, the way that we understand it, that this older form of exchange, symbolic exchange, like somehow was not abstracted from death. And I find this a really interesting idea because, we've actually talked on the show a little bit and on our Lost Horizons episodes a little bit of how one of the fundamental, I think, social norms, especially in the United States, is this constant denial of death. And I think it's really interesting to read Baudrillard's take here because it almost like grounds it materially and to say that maybe the reason why death is further and further like sort of disavowed in like general social and cultural norms isn't just something that's based in like a particular philosophy, although it could be, but it's really also about the type of exchange that we're most subjected to or that we find ourselves most embedded in.
He's kind of saying here that these hunter-gatherer, like prior, more quote-unquote primitive or like less developed cultures, we might say instead, they did not have the illusions that we do about our symbols being attached to a real. And that's the change where symbolic exchange no longer exists because we assume that like because of capitalism and that kind of substitution element that there is a real going on. So we're sort of deluded in that illusion, whereas more, I guess, less modern cultures in the past, we're fully operating like in a symbolic without having this idea of like the real. That demarcation line was a lot less, I guess, material in a sense. Like it was not a hard line, and I think the way that death is handled also plays a part in that too, because like you said, I think death was a lot more immediate to prior cultures, and now it's almost fully erased. Death is like the exception, whereas in the past it was understood as a normality, like it was an everyday thing because you're encountering it so much more intimately and like in a broader context of like, whatever cultural group you're participating in.
Actually, there's something really fascinating here that we're connecting some dots for me about. So recently, I think whenever we were doing one of our McGowan episodes, we were talking about the capital R real for Lacan and in psychoanalysis. And I remember Neil said, whenever he thinks about what the real is, it is primarily about the fact that our bodies die, that our life is essentially eventually going to be snuffed out in one way or the other. And reading your notes here, this is really fascinating because I almost get the sense that symbolic exchange, like death is continually engaged with precisely because maybe life was a lot more precarious, like you didn't have the same sort of level of industrial development and increasing lifespans, but you have here that it's in the sense of a radical indeterminacy. And I think that's actually a really beautiful connection point to say that maybe the idea of like the real is a lot more present in symbolic exchange because the real is the experience of death. And that's an experience of radical indeterminacy. That sort of idea that the entire symbolic order can at any moment be punctured through with the indeterminacy of like whether you're going to live or die in the next moment. And so there's a certain like materiality to that I've never really thought about those together, that I actually think this is like super helpful to think about.
Yeah, that's a really astute point. I'm kind of glad that you brought that up. I mean, we'll circle back around because I think chapter 5 is primarily where this aspect of death. I mean, that's like the biggest, meatiest chapter is chapter 5, where he's going through so many different trails of death and exchange, etc. We'll start on chapter 1, where it's called the end of production and I call this a move from production to consumption. And we already talked about how signs being exchanged against one another versus an actual real. And let's see this annihilation of any goals as regards to the contents of production that allow this to function as a code under a monetary sign, which is an escape into like this infinite speculation beyond any reference to like the actual real of production or to something like a gold standard, right? And again, thinking about this in terms of historical context, this is sort of right around the time that neoliberalism is really getting churned up. I forget, right around here is when like the Bretton Woods, like Nixon took us off of the gold standard at some point in the 70s. I don't remember a date. And at that point, again, like you can kind of see that breach in I guess the symbolic element of economics, or like this is kind of the jump into hyper reality whenever it comes to money as a pure like simulacrum.
Yeah. And I think this is really important too. And this is one of the things that I think it was actually a chapter from this book that I read of like a collection of Baudrillard essays that really knocked me on my ass, because it was, I think, closer to where Baudrillard, I think, was breaking from Marx. And so it's clear to see that sort of relationship between Marxist political economy and Baudrillard's approach. But essentially the idea was that the legacy of Marxist criticism and like sort of Capital Volume 1 especially is this idea that, and we've talked about this on some of our episodes, that essentially you need some sort of abstract signifier to mediate between two different things that you need to exchange. So like, let's say a cow and like a bale of hay or something like that, right? Or like a coat and linen. And the idea is that it is impossible to actually find an equivalence between these two things because they're radically distinct entities, right? So you have to have some sort of like symbolic mediator, of which money becomes this symbolic mediator to basically allow you to exchange things because you have reference to a universal establisher of value among these different things. And so what I really love about Baudrillard that I think is so crucial here is like he's kind of taking that idea and really like pushing it like past, this threshold, where it's the idea that now everything becomes so fundamentally beholden to that universal sort of signifier that actually doesn't have any materiality, like it's purely abstract, that all of a sudden now it's like you don't even need to reference like the code of the linen anymore. Now you just have like the abstract signifiers that are floating up here, not necessarily connected to anything, that you're now like engaging in exchange.
And yeah, I think that example of the break with the gold standard, like that's a very that's a very material example of exactly what you just described, I think, perfectly.
You have like so many great quotes in here. I want to read this just because I love this. He says, neither Saussure nor Marx had any presentiment of all this. They were still in the golden age of the dialectic of the sign and the real, which is at the same time the quote-unquote classical period of capital and value. Their dialectic is in shreds, and the real has died of the shock of value acquiring this fantastic autonomy. King shit. That's a really great Baudrillard quote.
Absolutely. And you touched on this too, and this is kind of in this next quote about this idea of equivalence as exchange and how money functions as a medium for equivalences. And that's going to operate through everything. That's going to operate in the configuration of this goes down into linguistics, into the sign, the signifier, and them facilitating that exchange of a referential content.
Yeah, and I think what's so crucial to me about Baudrillard is the idea of this like law of equivalences. These sort of signifiers develop their own autonomy that is no longer connected materially to anything about the use value of things. It's almost like everything is now just purely abstracted exchange value, and it develops this own like monstrous autonomy of its own.
Absolutely. And it's capitalism, I think, almost utilizing this as sort of a bulwark against any kind of, using this as a way to sort of reterritorialize any and smooth out any kind of resistance to its ends, right? To its ultimate logic.
So I wanted to ask you about this too, because there's this quote here where he says, if on the other hand, capital is a quote mode of domination, then we are always in the midst. This is because the structural law of value is the purest, most illegible form of social domination, like surplus value. It no longer has any references within a dominant class, and the quote breaks off. But I was curious here. So this is a really interesting thing, because I'm wondering how you understand this. Is Baudrillard saying here that, in a sense, capital as a mode of domination is something that is like primarily about the law of value as it exists in capitalism? And so like once that's like disconnected and functions autonomously, it's like you can't even really say, well, it's the bourgeoisie over here and it's the proletariat over here. It's now just this weird autonomous system of signs and like the code, because Baudrillard always talked about the code, that's sort of functioning that you can't even really place in like a particular material interest of a particular class. It's now this like weird disembodied thing that's like the mode of domination.
Yeah, I mean, that's you totally. I couldn't have said it any better. That's fantastic. I have nothing to add to that.
Okay, well, never mind. I answered my own question. That's like really interesting, right? Because to some degree, even today, whenever we talk about what is the most domineering oppressive thing about capitalism, I think that it's still very easy, I think, especially if you don't read shit like Baudrillard, to just say, well, it's still about, these two clearly defined classes, one here, and it's these things in opposition to each other. And I think again, I'm going to bracket whether I think that's still has to be maintained for a lot of different reasons, but at least for Baudrillard, right. The idea is that in this particular period, and I think this is especially true in May 68, right? The idea that, well, we put our faith in the proletariat and the workers to overthrow capitalism, and actually they were bought off by capitalism. They acquiesced, or like they were smashed ruthlessly and violently. And so it's also, I think, kind of grappling with how is it that the revolution didn't happen, even though, we have this highly unionized, like highly militant labor force that was supposed to be the sort of like harbinger of the revolution.
Right. I think that's a really astute point. I think that's a good thing to consider when you're looking at any, especially like if you're coming from the Marxist tradition and you're looking at post-structuralism, like, okay, there is a reason of it. Like apply your materialist brain to why people are doing this. Mm-hmm. It's because like, okay, well, it's 1968 and the revolution or movement or whatever like gets kind of crushed, and then what happens, right? Like, mm-hmm. How do you respond to that? That's had to be such a like huge defeat, and I've sometimes referred to that moment as kind of what I consider an end of history moment, in the sense of like we're sort of trapped in the deadly logic of capital until it simply collapses on it under its own weight, like like a forest fire, for example.
I still think there's a very good argument to be made that we have not actually escaped the political ramifications of May 68 and like the early 70s and the birth of neoliberalism. And in some ways, it's what Mark Fisher said, right? The future got canceled because it's just eternal repetition of the same basic logic that might be exacerbating in its contradictions and its violence and brutality, but at the same time, it hasn't really broken from that in any way. We're still struggling with that, I think.
Yeah, and I think Baudrillard goes into that, and I believe it's in chapter 4, might be 3 or 4, where he's discussing fashion, mm-hmm. and the cyclical nature of fashion. I think really maps onto that example that you just drew from Fisher, is it's sort of like this aesthetic reproduction of whether it be clothing or whether it be theory or ideas about revolution or class or political economy, right?
I'm also thinking about film, right? I'm thinking about the Marvel Cinematic Universe and how, most films are now like in these huge cinematic universes, right? There's Star Wars, there's like Marvel, and basically it's like now what major film production is all about is essentially just this like hyper self-referential story of like, it's pretty much the same story all the time with just slightly new characters, but it's always like the only way you can create a new film is to like constantly reference just the internal sort of signifiers within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It isn't like you can ever tell really, an interesting, like very different story. It's like it just becomes almost this way that it's like this gravity that you get caught in, and you're just like constantly referring to yourself over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good way to conceptualize it for sure, is sort of that closed self-referential system that is devoid from any kind of, capital R real.
Yeah, right. Because that's the thing, right? Because if the capital R real was to like break through in a Marvel Cinematic Universe film, that is almost like a structural impossibility, because the loop is so closed that it allows for no penetration of the real.
Yeah, it would kind of collapse in on itself.
Yeah, unless there was like a meteor that hit during like the production of Thor 26 or whatever they're going to make. That would be the capital R real, like encroaching upon the production.
Or COVID-19 is kind of the real piercing back into in that same way.
Yeah, that was galactic brain shit right there, right? Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly what something like a global pandemic will do. It's like, oh yeah, no matter how closed you think the loop is, like the real can always reinsert itself.
Yeah, and Baudrillard does absolutely, I think it's more so in Simulacra and Simulation, but he does say that the real from time to time, like it's sort of injections into, it's almost like if you're, like you're doing steroids, like sometimes you've got to like get that pump, you know what I mean? Maybe it's pre-workout or like creatine or something like that. Sometimes you have to inject that real kind of system churning along.
That's like whenever I take my can of Bang and I just basically inject it right into my jugular vein. That's the real. That's me injecting the real.
Red Bull may give you wings, but Power Burst gives you burst.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. Okay, so where do you want to go next before I get us spun out on a very bizarre tangent about the Marvel Cinematic Universe and more weird shit?
We talked a little bit about the gold standard and how that kind of plays into, I guess, macroeconomics. And I just want to, he does mention this too, that I think is a really good point that we should consider. National balance sheets now merely retrace a numerical and statistical growth devoid of meaning, an inflation of the signs of accountancy over which we can no longer even project the fantasy of the collective will, right? And so where this comes into play, I think you can see it most starkly now, right? In the Fed, right? The Fed is injecting all of this liquidity into the market, but it has no referent, like it has no value in itself, like it has no even, it's totally detached from the real entirely. Like this is just virtual currency. Like it doesn't, I don't know, I feel like there's a dialectical tension between actual value that exists like in the context of humanity and sort of value for value's sake, or the simulacrum of value or money or whatever, right? Like it's totally disentangled from any kind of real. I don't know if this sounds so repetitive, but I don't know. I think that's an interesting thing to take note of here.
I guess that kind of goes back to the idea of symbolic exchange and death, right? It's like the whole sort of basis of what you define as being valuable or not is now, at least in the way that Baudrillard describes it, is completely divorced from any sort of radical indeterminacy, right? And I mean, that's kind of what's so interesting, because like, even if you think about, let's say, a more classical political economic view in like Marxism, right? If you use the labor theory of value, the idea is still that, you could have some sort of radical indeterminacy, which could like destroy incredible amounts of value, like commodities or, capital, means of production or whatever. But in this sort of approach, the idea is like, the more abstracted things become, the less radical indeterminacy they're subject to. But, even then, right, it's like, but we all know that as like that happens more and more, you think about derivatives and like the housing collapse and everything else. It's like, the more you sort of abstract things away, it's like there is radical indeterminacy, and most of capitalism, and like financial capitalism specifically, is just a way of like, how do you spread risk out all across the globe to hopefully prevent everything completely having a nightmare crisis scenario just long enough that we can maximize our profits.
That's a really great model and way to conceive of that. What I think is interesting, and I think this is something that is becoming to the fore, like this contradiction within capitalism is making itself very apparent in this idea that we produce to produce rather than produce for any kind of like use value. It's sort of like the system reproducing itself in this simulated way. Like we have to, like there's always has to be a new commodity that's produced, but it's disentangled from any kind of value. The only reason it's produced is because we have to sort of keep the simulation sort of has to keep running in this way.
Yeah, I mean, this is why more and more people, especially in like developed capitalist countries, are having what is called the terror of object choice, where basically the more you're presented with more and more variations on the same exact commodity, it's like distinction without a difference. It's like there really is no real distinction between this flavor of Cocoa Krispies and this flavor of Count Chocula. But the more you get presented with these distinctions that are like further and further abstracted and really just like creating new commodities just to keep the simulation sort of functioning, to keep it like floating in air so it doesn't crash. Like in some ways, like the more, I think it's almost like the more like terror and like the more anxiety and like completely like depressive sorts of effects it has on us as like actual like people who are like keeping the system running as well, right? Because we're also implicated in it.
Yeah, a big part of this too is now, and I think, I feel like maybe we do have to bracket this again in terms of the West and in terms of like the imperial core. It's like the U.S. consumer is the driver of like of economics. And so now not only are you doing this kind of faux production element during the workday, but now your job, your labor is also consumption itself becomes an element of labor. And you see this breaking down now because now that people can't go to, well, I guess in Texas we're reopened, but right, whenever people can't go to restaurants and they can't go to movie theaters and they can't do all of these things, it really underscores this idea of like production for production's sake, and then consumption being like the driver of, I guess, meaning. And you look at the violent reaction to not being able to consume you have people storming Capitol buildings with guns. You have like all these protests, and I think this is absolutely tied into that. And I sent you that tweet earlier, right? It's like there's a store in Arkansas. And
yeah, thank you for bringing this up. Yeah,
it's like a TJ Maxx or something, and the fucking store is packed. Not only is it packed, but you only see 2 folks that are actually like wearing a mask in the store itself. And it's like, there is why it doesn't make sense, because there is nothing inherently necessary to human survival about shopping at TJ Maxx or even having 50 different types of cereal to eat, or, you know what I mean? Like, that is sort of that self-referential system.
Go off, King. Go off.
So it's like there's no real necessity to consume these products other than the system requiring you to do so to sustain itself, and through ideology making you feel like that is establishing that as normal. The overcoding.
I think this is actually one of the things that is so important whenever you're talking about theories of value. So the neoclassical economic theory of value is essentially that, well, what really kind of gives things their value is the demand, right? The amount that people want them. Like, and this is where like the very simplistic idea of like supply and demand curves comes from. But the thing that is so important, especially from like, anarchist, Marxist, whatever sort of perspective, is to say, yeah, but like demand is something that is a socially generated thing, right? Society also can instill and like create new demands. And, pure ideology creates many, many demands under capitalism. Like the idea that, yes, you actually do need to go to that TJ Maxx and have 50 kinds of, chocolate flavored cereal with just slightly different shapes. It's like there's a sort of social context and like a mediation by capital and the way that those desires get generated that is never really grappled with. Because to grapple with that in this sort of neoclassical kind of approach would be to inherently call in to question the very exact structures that is like the justifying ideology of that exact sort of form of economics.
It's pure ideology.
So I think that's like a really important thing to bring up is like, yeah, like what is the thing that's really creating all this demand and why we think we want these things? And it's like, it's an ideological sort of function of the larger prevailing political economic system that we're a part of. And I do think this is why we've been talking a lot on our McGowan series about the necessity of implicating yourself in the very critique, because to some degree, the code only continues functioning because we continue to invest in the code to some degree. And that's a really kind of shitty thing to think about, but it's also really relevant because TJ Maxx is open in that tweet you sent me because there were 50 people there, because those people went to TJ Maxx, and we have to grapple with that seriously.
Yeah, and I think that's actually an interesting point where we can say the super egoic injunction to enjoy, right? Is there a jouissance as part of like that exchange itself that is normalized and kind of like you feel, do you see what I'm like the point I'm trying to make about that's kind of I feel like that ties into this ressentiment of not being able to consume.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's like a really important connection to make, this idea that there's a kind of like resentment of, well, I'm not enjoying right now, but surely the other is enjoying, and I'm going to be resentful as fuck about that, and then react with violence to ensure that I get the same amount of pleasure and enjoyment that they get. I mean, this is actually, I think, a really important criticism and an approach to take whenever, I don't know if you've encountered these, but like more feminist and like queer theory critiques of heteronormativity and like misogyny is like part of the reason why like homophobia is like such this like violently intense thing that, a lot of like heteronormative men experience. Isn't like a lot of it has to do with deep down, it's this like fear that you're not actually getting the same kind of like sexual pleasure that you imagine that queer people are getting to experience. It's like the violence is this sort of like identification of you with the thing that you think is like your opposite. And I think that like this is a really powerful way that this functions even in things like consumption, like this idea that, oh, the other must be enjoying in the way that I'm not. And I then have this like violent, like death drive sort of response exactly to the thing that I think is having access to this enjoyment that I don't get to have myself. And I think that's a really powerful unconscious motivator for a lot of us.
Definitely. Just a couple of things to wrap up chapter 1 that I think are notable. One that I think is particularly interesting given our context is this idea that we're not given a wage for producing something quote unquote real. We are given a wage to consume now. And I think this particularly, again, makes sense in the context of the West, the imperial core. And whenever you think about something like UBI, right?
Yes,
like
yeah,
that,
exactly.
I think that really concretizes or materializes that idea, right? That, at some point, like capitalism consumption is more important, right? Like the whole concept of UBI is that there has to be this continual consumption. Otherwise, the whole system crashes. If people aren't wasting their money at Starbucks, then the whole fucking economy collapses, which is so fucking funny to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's like just tragic and bizarre, right? I mean, think about this. It's like the whole Trump bucks, your MAGA bucks, were specifically to say, listen, like everyone's losing their jobs, but you have to keep consuming no matter what.
Yeah.
Here's $1,200 or $2,400 if you're married or whatever. Like, please go consume. But this is like so funny, and I think this is something that even, let's say, more like radical liberal critiques and like radical liberal like policy responses don't really like grapple with seriously. And this is partially why they always like fail to really challenge capitalism. Think about someone calling for like a complete abolition of student debt. Now, let me just say right out of the gate, I have a shit ton of student debt. I would love for that to be abolished like yesterday, right? But a lot of times, like the whole criticism of this is, or like the whole reasoning and rationale behind it is to say, well, if people weren't paying, $500 a month in student loan payments, they could then push that money into the economy. And the whole argument there is that those people would be better consumers. They would be more efficient and effective and impactful as consumers if they weren't paying these debts. And so, again, just to kind of recognize, like, that's the rationale of that sort of radical liberal critique, is to say that it's really about allowing us to be able to consume more effectively versus necessarily like challenging like a hyper exploitative and like oppressive system.
Maybe my understanding of macro or microeconomics isn't that great, admittedly, but at the same time, like that doesn't make sense to me as well, because it kind of falls into that trap of like government spending. Like government spending still goes into the economy. It's like though the student loan payments are going into whatever financial institutions, right? And then like under the guise of capitalism, that money is being spent somewhere, right? Like it is. So I'm wondering where that breakdown, or like what the thought process is there, or if it even makes any sense to begin with.
I mean, maybe not. I mean, I'm not necessarily a macroeconomics scholar by any means. So, but yeah, I mean, my idea is it's more of just kind of like a reallocation of where is the money, sort of like how the circulation is flowing, and sort of
maybe it's the speed. Maybe that's it. That the differentiation is the speed. Like are you familiar with this term, the velocity of money?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I don't know a ton about it, but I know the term.
There has to be a speed, like there has to be this kind of constant exchange, and that churn of exchange itself generates profit. Because, like we said earlier, right, it's become completely symbolic. It's totally detached from like real value, and it's kind of generating its own, simulated value.
From what I do know, this is why you can make just in completely just vomit-inducing amount of money if you can develop like a trading program that can turn trades over a little bit faster, or can maximize like the sort of timing of your trades on the market. So these little like fractions of a penny, like millions of times over, like repeatedly for 2 weeks, will eventually generate like enormous amounts of profit. So, I mean, this is like a basic fundamental aspect of David Harvey's interpretation of capital and how capital works, is that it really is about things have to be constantly in motion, always, for capital to actually continue functioning. And how you can exploit the velocity or the speed at which like money circulates or trades happen, like, is actually like a primary driver of profit, and like where people find profit, and where, is what Matt Taibbi once said, like financial capital will like jam its blood funnel because it's this huge, like gargantuan, like vampiric squid. Like that's kind of what it's doing. It's always finding like where are these little places we can suck just a little bit more profit out of the system. And a lot of it has to do with like the way that the timing of the process of capital and like exchange is happening.
So I did pull an example, or a rough definition from Investopedia.
Speak on it, King.
The velocity of money is a measurement of the rate at which money is exchanged in an economy. It is the number of times that money moves from one entity to another. It also refers to how much a unit of currency is used in a given period of time. Simply put, it's the rate at which consumers and businesses in an economy collectively spend money. And it's usually measured as a ratio of GDP to countries' M1 or M2 money supply. which I don't think we really need to get into.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there is like, I don't know, there's some type of relationship going on there. And I think that like you said, that almost like float of just weird mathematical anomalies generate profit or like excess or wealth or whatever the case may be, or surplus rather. Surplus might be the better way to like feeling, just like that continuing friction of money and exchange itself. That process somehow generates this surplus on its own.
That's really interesting, right? The idea of like in Marxism, the entire explanation of where profit comes from is its surplus value. The idea is that a lot of that surplus value isn't necessarily coming from exploitation of workers. I mean, it is. It's just a question of like how this process actually functions. But the way that you kind of see it from the outside is it really is about like the exploitation of these trades and like the timing of the system to then like find, oh, these are these like little potent points where you can extract more surplus out of just that part of the process. So, again, it's like the way that it functions has changed, even if the same general idea is like to extract more and more surplus value.
I dare say too that it may have something to do with the falling rate of profit as well as a part of this too, is like all these derivatives and this like whole simulated economy works is like, because like it has to find like this is the only place that it capital is trying to like get its tendrils into like any way that it can squeeze out any kind of surplus, because it can't simply do it through productive labor of itself.
Yeah, and also because there's a finite limit to how much people can consume. So
right,
like where else is it gonna, you have to find it from someplace. So I tell you what, at some point you just hit on something that we should bracket the question of the falling rate of profit, but we should maybe do an episode on that at some point. That would be really fun.
Moving forward to kind of close out this chapter, Baudrillard does give two references to some type of, not quite prescriptive, but he is talking about how do we fight the system, and he says that we cannot defeat the system on the plane of the real. I don't quite know exactly what he means by that fully, but I kind of get it. And it makes sense and I think that's the kind of post-Marxist element is, I think maybe the Marxist idea is, hey, we can confront capital on its own terms and defeat it. And maybe Baudrillard is saying, no, that is no longer possible given the materiality from which we exist now.
Yeah, I actually think this is a really interesting point, because at the risk of bastardizing Baudrillard with a Matrix reference, but I'm going to do it anyway because fuck Baudrillard, he's dead. But it's almost like if the simulacrum, or like this abstracted just like code that's like monstrously autonomous, is what we all are experiencing, like you can't necessarily confront the system itself within the code. Yeah, it's like you can't fight capital on the plane of the real because capital isn't existing on the plane of the real in any way that we experience it. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? It's like if you wanted to like confront capital, I mean, this is a thing to think about with Occupy. It's like, what does that look like? Is it like going to Occupy Zuccotti Park? Is it like going and smashing up the servers that are used by like major hedge funds to like make these trades and like manage portfolios? I mean, I don't have a good answer for this, but it's different than saying like, like capital is this wealthy robber baron that lives over here on this side of town, and you can go show up at their house with pitchforks, and you can like, it's like you can't necessarily confront capital in the same way, or at least I think in Baudrillard's idea, like you can't necessarily confront it in the same way anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way to frame it. I want to quote this too, and then we can move on to chapter 2. Mm-hmm. But I thought this was interesting, and I think tied, and this may be the most prescriptive thing about Baudrillard, is this idea of symbolic exchange being a potential way to, I don't know, fight or resist or something. I don't know. I'm not 100% clear on exactly what this means, but I'm going to read this.
Go for it.
To defy the system with a gift to which it cannot respond, save by its own collapse and death, nothing, not even the system, can avoid the symbolic obligation. And it is in this trap that the only chance of a catastrophe for capital remains. This is kind of bullshit, but I think this is kind of a shitpost kind of discussion here. But I've jokingly had this kind of idea that just based on semiotics and tying that to kind of like chaos magic, like there's one sign that can be spoken that would like totally unravel capitalism just by like making some enunciation. Like there's some kind of spell, right, that will just destabilize the entire system of signs, and like the whole thing kind of folds on itself somehow. But I don't know exactly how that works in like a material, system of revolution or whatever. But I don't know. That's kind of a joke I've had about semiotics and the power of them.
Hell yeah, real magic hours, real chaos magic hours on Red Library today. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I think that so much of the post-structuralist approach, I mean, I think there are really, really powerful and important things about talking about signifiers and the code and the autonomous way that the system of signs now functions. And it's almost like, I find this idea really interesting and almost kind of a logical consequence of that being the primary point of focus. It's like, if now everything is signs, then it would make sense that the only possibility to resist that system would then thereby have to be like the signifier that fell out. This is almost like a Lacanian way to talk about this that we've talked about in our What is Sex episodes. It's like there's this idea that there has to be like at least the fantasy of a signifier that it's the one that isn't included in the system itself, but the system is like it's logically structured around. So at the risk of also shit posting about Lacan and Alenka Zupancic here, I mean, the idea is that the whole system has to be structured around something that is absent. So I've actually recently been reading a lot of Mari Rudy in some preparation for episodes that we're going to do. And Mari Rudy has this great way of describing this as like a concept. So it's the idea that like in a piece of like elbow macaroni, the whole structure of the elbow macaroni is all organized around like a hollow space that runs through it.
Okay.
And so the idea is that in this sort of Lacanian psychoanalytic perspective, the thing that keeps the system of signs operating, the symbolic operating, is that there has to be this like gap or this sort of like hollow space that isn't actually there, but like you're sort of fundamentally sort of always like including it in the way that the entire order functions. It's this like weird ontological principle of how structure only exists like organized around an absence. And I think there's some sort of way that this like Baudrillard kind of based approach, it's almost like that's kind of inevitably what you're going to think about. It's like there has to be some sort of signifier that isn't included, but if somehow you could like operate from that place of like negativity, that would be the thing that would challenge the system. And that's why it's the real. It's radical indeterminacy. I think this is exactly why Zupancic at the end of What is Sex says that the fundamental like structuring negativity of capitalism is what we call the proletariat. Like that's what the proletariat is. It isn't necessarily like this, like these two classes faced off against each other. It's the structure, which is capital, and then the proletariat is the organizing, like negative absence at its core. And that's precisely why it's always like the revolutionary class, is because it's the class that's operating from this place of negativity.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, that's like a whole other episode to talk about that. But I think that it's a really interesting idea because like Baudrillard is trying to offer some way to say like maybe this kind of symbolic exchange, which somehow would take into account like closeness to death and radical indeterminacy, would somehow be like the thing that would disrupt the whole code. It would like sort of bring about the crack in the symbolic, maybe.
You know what's funny too is like, this is amusing to me, is that quote, to defy the system with a gift for which it cannot respond, save by its own collapse and death. I just thought of this from like a Song of Ice and Fire. Like, isn't that what the faceless men give, is the gift of death, right?
Yeah,
I thought that was an interesting kind of tie-in. But I don't know what's the like ultimate gift that we can give to the system to bring it down. I don't know how to answer that question.
Waifu body pillow.
The concept, I think, is absolutely fascinating because the gift is exchange, but is there no, I don't know how that breaks down. Like, because are gifts necessarily reciprocal, or is it one-sided? You know what I mean? I think maybe that's an interesting question too, because looking at things like potlatch or what have you, like there was the sign of status in potlatch, if I'm not mistaken, is the more that you're able to give away, like that reifies how wealthy or powerful you are, because you have so many resources to give away. And maybe that's where symbolic exchange is different from this kind of weird, whatever our modern exchange situation is.
I mean, I think to some degree, this is maybe the like radical dream, of things like mutual aid networks and anarcho-communist approaches, because that's like the whole approach is mutual aid, right? But I think in some ways, like what they're trying to get at is this like form of exchange that like exists outside the realm of the commodity and outside the realm of like capital, is to say that like, no, like we're going to build a network of exchange that is symbolic exchange. It's just about, sort of this radical indeterminacy. Like it isn't based on value per se, and then the question is like, does that actually challenge the system thoroughly enough and to bring about a sort of crisis where like capital would have to respond with its own collapse and death? I mean, I don't know. I mean, these are like fundamental revolutionary theory questions, right? Of like, the basic question is like, how do you get outside a system that it's one of its main tools, and what it's like so incredibly like clever at is commodifying resistance. Like that's the thing. It's like, it can't just be like the symbol, right? Because capital can always like incorporate the symbol into itself and then commodify that in a new way. So what do you do if every symbol like you can create can then be commodified?
Yeah, it's almost like that the territorialization and reterritorialization of Deleuze and Guattari, right? Mm-hmm. But it's now that capitalism is operating via the internet at the speed of light, it's like it can move so much fast, like it can move in an instant to reterritorialize anything the second that it shows any possibility of destabilizing the system. Like it's immediately, as soon as that crack comes and you exploit it, it's closed.
Mm-hmm. Or even think about things on Twitter, right? How like you can be just some random Twitter poster and like speak out against Turkey, and then the next thing you know, you're getting attacked by like bots of like the Turkish state and Erdogan who are just like randomly trying to like destroy you and like silence you. I mean, it's just like, and that happens instantly.
That is funny that you mentioned that, because I did have a similar experience with I had just made a shit post, and it was like Tulsi Gabbard and Modi together in a picture, and I was like,
oh shit!
I was like, oh shit, Tulsi's going sicko Modi, and then I had some presumably Indian person that was like in my mentions calling me a white racist for like criticizing Modi, which I thought was really funny, because like it wasn't really even about Modi at all. It was just like about this kind of joke of. It was like a pun, right? Modi, sicko mode, you know what I mean?
Like basically they just did some like keyword search for Modi, and anyone who posted
right?
anything.
Yeah, who the fuck is you're name searching Modi? What the fuck is wrong with you?
I mean, you're probably getting a paycheck. Or yeah, you're just like a hyper ideological, Modi stan.
So bizarre.
But, do you want to go to chapter 2?
Let's go to chapter 2, where the focus is on the order of simulacra. And I'll just read this, to be honest.
Yeah, go for it.
Out of the text, where Baudrillard describes the 3 order of simulacra that all run parallel to the successive mutations of the law of value since the Renaissance.
Oh, that was so cultured how you said that.
The counterfeit is the dominant schema in the classical period, from the Renaissance to the Industrial Revolution. Production, this is number 2, that was number 1. Production is the dominant schema in the industrial era. And then 3, simulation is the dominant schema in the current code-governed phase. The first order simulacrum operates on the natural law of value, the second order on the market law of value, and then the third order on the structural law of value. And I think maybe that's something that I haven't articulated that well, is that structural law of value that is in itself like decoupled, I think, from that productive era, that second order of simulacrum that was the dominant scheme in the industrial kind of very much like productive era, where production was the most important mode of the economy or exchange or what have you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, whenever I think about the counterfeit, at first I was a little kind of thrown through a loop. I'm like, the counterfeit? But I guess like the idea is that I think of almost like Renaissance art, and how, there was like an industry of people who could counterfeit great works of art, like almost perfect in their representation of those things. And so I guess the idea would be that what determines value in like this period from the Renaissance to the Industrial Revolution is sort of like the artistry or like the craftsmanship of the person who made it.
Okay.
And so then being able to replicate that level of like mastery and craftsmanship or artistry through something that's counterfeited would almost be like, the law of value is essentially like, oh, these things naturally have value in themselves because of like their beauty or because of like their artistry. And so it's almost like that the way you build value then, or like how sort of you replicate value, is then being able to replicate something that is totally novel and unique, right? It's like you can't paint the Sistine Chapel or you can't paint like a Rembrandt over and over and over again, right? It's like it's that one painting that has that unique value. So it's inevitable that you must counterfeit it, or you must make like a limited number of representations or copies of that to then like expand its value, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. That's a really good way. I'm glad you took that, because I was kind of struggling to figure out how to explain that. I don't know if production being the dominant schema in the industrial era necessitates that much description. I think
that one's more straightforward, I think.
Marxist political economy has kind of gone through that. What I think is interesting is to explore that the code governed phase that we're currently in. And I stumbled upon this is amazing. If you want to understand what Baudrillard is getting at when it comes to simulacra and simulation, this is perfect. So I did crib this from, there's like a Where Do I Start with Baudrillard post on Reddit that linked this analysis of Waluigi by Franck Ribéry, which is funny. It's like, is this the fucking French soccer player wrote this?
Or someone writing as the French soccer player,
right?
Which would be pure Baudrillardian shit.
So I'm just going to read their paragraph here. Waluigi is the ultimate example of the individual shaped by the signifier. Waluigi is a man seen only in mirror images. Lost in a hall of mirrors, he is a reflection of a reflection of a reflection. You start with Mario, the wholesome all-Italian plumbing Superman. You reflect him to create Luigi, who is the same thing but slightly less. You then invert Mario to create Wario, and this is Mario turned septic and libertarian. Then you reflect the inversion in the reflection. You create a being who can only exist in reference to others. Waluigi is the true nowhere man. Without the other characters he reflects, inverts, and parodies, he has no reason to exist. Waluigi's identity only comes from what and who he isn't. Without a wider frame of reference, he is nothing. He is not his own man. In a world where our identities are shaped by our warped relationships to brands and commerce, we are all Waluigi.
I'll give you my Stalinist claps for that. That is a hell of a find.
So I think that is that is the simulacrum.
Yeah.
Is Waluigi. And you can see really the way that Franck lays this out follows that same progression of the orders of simulacra, because we start, let's say Mario would perhaps fall into the sort of counterfeit, right? Because we have Luigi would be a counterfeit Mario in a sense, right? And then moving forward, then we create the Wario, who is the inversion, and then that might be the second phase. I don't know. That kind of doesn't map entirely perfectly. I don't know, unless you can map that.
I'm willing to just accept it as true. So let's just say that Wario maps onto the system of production. So let's fuck it.
And then the third, obviously, so Waluigi of his own accord makes absolutely no sense, right? Outside of the context of Mario to begin with, it's what the fuck is it? It's nothing, right? only in the order of signifiers and signifieds and signs does something like Waluigi make any sense, or is there even a possibility of generating that, right? That is simulacrum.
This is actually such a beautiful description of an incredibly hard to understand concept, but this is perfect. I want to ask you a question, because I feel like we're going to talk about fashion in chapter 3, and I also feel like you're an incredibly stylish individual. So, and I know you have some relationship to fashion as an industry, so I want to ask you about this.
Sure.
So whenever I think about subjectivity, or sort of like being a person in the simulation, and how he says that So Waluigi is not his own man. In a world where our identities are shaped by our warped relationships to brands and commerce, we are all Waluigi. So I immediately thought, like, what does this look like day to day? Like, what is an actual example of this that I can reference that kind of helps me make sense of how this relationship to brands and commerce, like, what's a real concrete material example of this and that I can reference, right, to help me make sense of it? And the first thing I thought about was the hype beast.
Yo, I'm so stoked I picked up these dunks, bro. You like these?
I don't really mess with dunks, bro.
Dude, you don't like dunks? These are crazy and they're so limited.
Huh? Limited?
How limited, bro? These are actually pretty fire, bro. How much? I'll buy it off you.
What's the name for someone who's like obsessed with sneakers?
Sneakerhead.
Sneakerhead.
Hypebeast. Hypebeast is probably the better one. I mean, there's fuckboy sometimes too is also
There's like a Venn
Hypebeast.
diagram between all three of these, but whenever I think about like a hype beast, you know, someone who like their whole existence is like sitting in line to get like the next Supreme brick that's being sold or something, I almost imagine it's like that's this kind of experience of subjectivity. Is like everything is built around your relationship to these brands, and it's almost like hype beast wouldn't even exist if there wasn't these brands and these like clothing manufacturers who create these commodities. And then, you know, the thing about the brick, right? You have a brick that has Supreme stamped on it and it's like $500 or whatever. It's like, where's the value that is being created here? It's like there is no value outside of just the reference of Supreme to itself.
Absolutely. Which that's synonymous with Waluigi, right?
Yeah.
In a sense. It's like the subject is attempting to, I mean, maybe this is, it's weird too, because if this kind of maps onto Lacan really, really well with desire and like the objet a as well, because the brick is the objet a in a sense, right? Like it houses the symbolic meaning, but it's not the meaning in itself. Like the brick is not the object of desire. It is the symbolic aspect of it. That's what you desire, right?
It's like,
I probably bastardized Lacan pretty bad there.
no, I think that's actually a really great point. It's like the object itself like has no other purpose or function outside of like you think it contains this excess. You think it contains this special sort of like das Ding, right? It's like the thing that if I just had that thing, it would make me feel wholly complete and satisfied. But it's almost like Supreme is so like, it's like in some ways I wouldn't be surprised if they have a bunch of people reading Lacan and like Lacan seminars and Zizek and then marketing based on it, because that's like a perfect representation of that in the commodity. It's like this is completely like irrational and like low-key insane that like you would spend $500 or whatever it was on a brick that just has Supreme stamped on it. But in a certain way, it's like this is the pure representation of Lacan's sort of approach to desire. And like how subjectivity is formed is like, yeah, it's like I just need this thing because like I'm not a whole subject unless I have it. But the thing that you're actually after is like this weird phantasmic representation of like a signifier that doesn't actually exist.
I think also, I don't know, this may be too strong of a statement to make, but in some ways I feel like this totally blows up the concept of the labor theory of value, or hell, even like use value in a sense, because, or maybe it doesn't actually, because I'm thinking like, okay, so like the people that are making the actual Supreme brick,
there you go.
Like what's like the surplus value, it's not exactly being extracted from their labor, but it kind of is. I don't know, there's a weird like contradiction there. Do you see what I'm saying? Like,
absolutely. It's
different from like, okay, we're going to buy this brick, or we're going to, sell this brick for $20 and it took the worker 10. Instead, like this brick costs $10 to make and we're going to sell it for 500. The value isn't necessarily being extracted from the worker, but it kind of still is. I don't know. That's weird, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's actually a really fascinating thing to bring up, because my way of understanding that is to say that there is a certain level of like symbolic mediation and the code that is part of what allows you to charge unbelievable rates to like have someone buy the stupid brick, right? But I'm assuming that the people who are doing media and PR for Supreme aren't the ones making the brick. There is a material element of production there. But if you look at the whole production process and the circulation process, and this is where for Marxists, and I'm just going to say this for everyone listening, please, for the love of God and gods and Shiva and whoever else, don't just read Capital Volume 1. You got to read Volumes 2 and even try to read Volume 3, because it isn't just production. It's always production and circulation and the realization of profit that are part of, that's like the total process. So I can imagine that brick, if you just thought about production, it would be hard to make sense of it, because you'd say, well, whoever it was, like the craftsman or whoever it was, whoever made the brick, right? The workers that produced that brick. It's like, well, they maybe made $10 and maybe but how is it possible that this brick could then be charged, like you could pay $500 for the brick and the company could realize, like $490 of profit. And the point is to say that, well, but if you look at the total process, the amount of profit that's being realized by Supreme, let's say is $490, or hell, like cut out some distribution costs and whatever else, say they make $300 in profit. The thing is that in the total process of production, that worker is actually being more exploited because Supreme has learned how to jack up the realization of surplus value precisely through the exploitation of the code and the exploitation of the simulation and how much we're all invested in it. It's like in the total process of production, I would almost say the worker is exploited more because they're actually denied less and less of the actual profit of the thing that they've created.
True. And I think even too, something to consider in that element as well is the absolute intensification of the division of labor itself, because I doubt that Supreme is not making the brick, they're outsourcing that production to someone else.
Yeah,
I would almost
absolutely.
I don't know that for a fact, but I feel like there's a legit brick producing company that they're simply slapping their Supreme, somehow getting their branding on it. In that process, Supreme is not adding any real value to the commodity itself in the sense of use value. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But I don't know, it's kind of weird. It's a weird short circuiting too of how we consider, I think, or should think about something like surplus value.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, my way of thinking about it is just that it's just so thoroughly complicated, and I think it's much more bizarre in the world now precisely because of the shit that Baudrillard is talking about. That's why it's you can read Marx and understand that, yeah, if we're talking about making a bunch of pins in a factory in 1860 in Manchester, sure. But how do you explain Supreme and this brick through the same theory? And it's I think you can I think there's still a lot to be said for it. It's also at the same time, it's but that theory is 150 years old, the way that Marx described it. And, just to understand that the relations of production and technological advancements have changed materially how production happens and how we think about value.
Absolutely.
All right, that does it with me and Triple C on part 1 of Jean Baudrillard's Symbolic Exchange and Death. You can find part 2 drop in next Sunday, same time, same place. And we're going to pick up there with more in-depth discussion of fashion. We're going to talk specifically about Symbolic Exchange and Death in Chapter 5, which Triple C alluded to in this episode, and lots more good stuff. Again, just big shout out to Cooper for really doing the homework on this one, doing a lot of rigorous prep, and really, I think, pulling this text apart and helping me as well come up with some connection points with some of our other episodes on McGowan, some past work that we've done. So big shout out, Cooper. Thanks. This is the whole dynamic dialectical process of us engaging together in mutual theoretical exploration. Just as a quick reminder, remember that Red Library is part of the Lost Horizons podcasting network, along with our podrads over at The Regrettable Century and From 78. Remember to check our Lost Horizons network feed you can find on pretty much any podcast catcher you might use, just to hear our collaborative roundtable discussions on a lot of the similar themes and exploratory approaches to dialectical pessimism we've all been exploring on our individual shows in different ways and collaborating on more and more now, which I'm very, very happy to say. We're going to get out of here for the week. We got more reading to do, more study to engage in, more radical thoughts to cook up, more theoretical deep dives to conduct, more existential crises to explore, and more friends to make along the way. As always, y'all, stay hydrated, stay motivated, stay liberated, Keep searching for ways to be emancipated. Just keep looking for those lost futures now more than ever, Same thing as always, really. Keep dreaming, keep fighting, keep studying, keep reading, keep thinking. And as always, your comrades over here at Red Library are going to be there every step of the way. And if you're ever lonely, if you're ever feeling isolated in the quarantine, just remember, we out here. We ain't going anywhere. Come find us and then find the others. Peace.